welcome to another edition of Tales from the Naked Bigfoot. I am your host, Mike the Naked Bigfoot. I know that sounds a lot more formal than my other ones, doesn't it? I love it. But before we begin tonight's tale, there's viewer discretion, of course, is always advised. If you have any children in the room, have any children watching it with you, or within earshot, or if you yourself are a sensitive type and you're watching this video, be warned that there will be, from your humble and kind host, the occasional bad word being spoken. The word that I enjoy using the most is the word fuck. So if you're offended by the word fuck, or you don't want your kids to learn it just yet, then please send them out of the room, or listen to me very quietly on a low volume with headphones that you can turn me down fairly quickly as soon as you hear me start uttering the word fuck. Because I will promise you it will happen. And as always, all the views, opinions, and are of the Naked Bigfoot's views and opinions are not meant to change your mind about anything. I am merely here to educate and entertain. And with that, hey, I don't say what. Hey, Papa Joey, thanks for joining in tonight. You may enjoy this. Tonight's tale. I've been asked, because as a lot of people may or may not know about your friendly neighborhood and Naked Bigfoot, is that he was born and raised in the Appalachian Mountains. People always laugh at me and go, "What do you mean you were born in the Appalachian Mountains? What state were you born in?" Ooh, me? I honestly didn't know what state I was living in when I was being brought up until I was age 14. I shit you not. I had no idea what state that I lived in. The community that I was born in was very insular. Eventually, when my family moved out of the mountains, they moved me I started attending a public school in Virginia, and realized that that we lived in Virginia then. I know that's wild, but that accounts for, as you'll find out in this story tonight, that it accounts for many of my curious and interesting mannerisms, and the fact that I don't speak with an accent as well. Oh, it's been a while since I've seen that movie. I need to watch it again. I love Monty Python a great deal, so it's going to take me a hot minute to get it, so to go back and watch it. I'm sure I've got it somewhere in my vast video library. Okay, back to tonight's tale. Tonight's tale is going to start in the old world in Europe, and it's going to end here in the United States, namely in the Appalachian Mountains. It is the Tale of the Leshy. That's Leshy for anybody who's interested. And it's pronounced depending on, it's a Slavic word. Mainly that the name Leshy is mainly used in what was Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, and Yugoslavia, when it was Yugoslavia before it broke up into 1,000 little pieces. But in Russia and on the steppes of Russia, it went by other names, but it was spelled in other ways, but it was always pronounced the same as Leshy, which I always found fascinating. And what is a leshy, you may ask? Well, according to Slavic lore, a the leshy, or a leshy, because it's not one singular being, it's actually a group. It's more than one. Um, it's not just one creature. It's actually it's a leshy is think of them more as a tribe. It's a group of creatures that are all pretty much all the same. But they are a forest spirit. Now, let me explain to you when I use the word spirit. Um, when you usually hear the word spirit, when you're talking about the paranormal or the supernatural, you think of something ephemeral or something ghost like. But in the old ways and old traditions, the word spirit referred to something that wasn't human. It could refer to the classic ghost or spirit. Hey, welcome, welcome, welcome. It's awesome to have you on tonight, Chris. Um, the word spirit in the old traditions referred to something that was not human, never was human. It referred to something that existed outside the mortal world, and it could be something that was physical. It could be something that was more ephemeral, like a ghostly type spirit. Um, or it could be a combination of the two. And when we speak of the Leshy, it is a combination of the two. Um, the Leshy was, again, as I said before, was a forest spirit. And I felt the need to explain the word spirit, but the word spirit is not used the way that it should be used, and by most modern supernatural and paranormal uh, investigators or historians. And I feel it necessary to bring us back to the old ways of referring to things like that, because it makes them it makes more sense than to describe everything as, a ghost or as a ghost of some sort. So I think it's lazy to use the spirit only to define a ghost by people nowadays that involve themselves in the supernatural paranormal community or even the cryptid community. It's a lazy way of using it, because everybody else is using it that way doesn't mean you should be using it that way. You should be using it properly. I know I got preachy for a moment there, but couldn't help it. Okay, back to the Leshy. It is a Slavic forest spirit, and when I say that, it is a creature that dwelled within the darkened and emerald forest throughout places like the Ukraine and Russia and other Slavic areas and countrysides. Um, it was a shape changer, as most of the old world forest spirits were. They could assume any form that they wished. They could assume a more human form with animalistic qualities. They could appear as any of the local animals. They could appear as a bird. They could appear as a person, as a child. Um, they could appear as a stag, a hare, whatever they wished to be at the time. But more importantly, they were known for being tricksters. Now, a trickster, depending on the cultural beliefs, could be something very beneficial, something that could educate the people, something that was helpful to the cultural, to the people, to the tribe, or it could be something that was very, very dangerous. And in this sense, the Leshy is a trickster in the dangerous sense of the word. Oh, one more little descriptive fun fact about the Leshy. A Leshy was bound to the forest in which it was spawned in. When it stepped out of the nothingness that is the spirit world and became and put itself in a material body. Whatever forest it stepped into, it was bound to that. Its power was bound to that forest. A Leshy could assume, no matter what form it took, whether it was an animal or a human child, and you'll understand later when I keep going back to referring to it as that could become a child. Um, it was it would differ in size. It could be as tall as the tallest tree in its forest, or as small as the smallest blade of grass in its forest. It was its choice. Now, it does sound fleshy, doesn't it? There might be some connections to it there. God knows if I consult my big black book of bad things, I might even find a connection in there in the etymological word flesh and the word lesh, how they work together. There might be some etymological history there, using my big words tonight. A leshy, if it chose to step out of the forest that it was in, if it stepped right out of the woods past the boundaries that it was established, it would lose the majority of its power. It would actually shrink down to the size of as small as a blade of grass, and it would not be able to resume any sort of size or shape-shifting abilities until it re-entered its forest, which I found that interesting, that it was tied to the land on which it was born in, or the land that it chose to dwell in. It became one with that land. Now let's talk more about the Leshy as a trickster. Um, Again, when I use the word trickster in this sense, it's not like the trickster uh, coyote and Native American and the coyote and a lot of Native American beliefs. The coyote was very helpful. Um, it would do funny things to people to teach them lessons, but it was never overtly dangerous. Now, the Leshy is something that is overtly dangerous. Um, the Leshy is when they categorize the old world Fae, and in Fae that's Fae, as in talking about the fairy folk and the spiritual forest folk. It was considered a wild Fae, meaning that it owed no allegiance to anything but itself. And anybody who strayed into the territory of a Leshy, mainly people, whether it be a child, a woman, or a man, or a group of people, um, the Leshy would go out of its way um, to force an encounter between itself and the people that entered its forest. It could be something as simple as, and something that it frequently did, would be to mimic the voices that it heard of the people that were in the woods. Um, you would hear a woman or a small child crying somewhere in the distance in the woods. Or you would hear somebody giggling and laughing in the woods, a man giggling or laughing in the woods, or a woman or a child giggling and laughing in the woods. Um, but if the people who were trespassing the Leshy's territory were wise to the Leshy, if they grew up with the stories, which most of them did, they grew up the stories of the Leshy, they were not foolish enough to follow the sounds off the trail and go looking for what was making that sound. Um, unless you were a hunter, of course, because they were infamous for luring hunters off their trail and luring them deeper into the woods by imitating the sounds of the prey in which they were hunting at the time. But the trick was the Leshy, if it encountered a hunter in its woods and it was daytime, this is how you would always be able to figure out that it was the Leshy, if you were wise enough to know. And wisdom is not, as we know, and is not a human trait. It's not something that's found very often in a lot of humans out there. They the prey animals, or the animals, the sounds they would imitate were of animals that would not be active at the time in which they were doing it. So during the day, a Leshy may imitate the sound of an owl. At night, it may imitate the sound of say, a fox in the woods. And a fox wouldn't be active at night at that time of night for it to do it. They would always imitate the sounds and project the sounds of these animals that were outside its natural time in which it should be awake and active. And a wise and careful hunter would notice that and not be lured off the trail to go hunt these impossible animals in the woods. But what was the purpose of the Leshy doing this or making sounds and trying to lure people off the road? And now, if you were foolish enough to follow the sounds that a Leshy were making, and you went into the woods, you would normally, and when you eventually came face to face with the Leshy after much traveling in the woods and getting lost, the Leshy would make sure you would be able to find it. And it would always appear, if it was an animal that it would appear as, it would be an animal that was much larger than what you would naturally would occur in nature. Um, you'd encounter a rabbit or a fox the size of a bear. That's how they would appear. It'd be something much, much larger. Or you'd discover a stag that was twice the size of a Canadian moose. Um, the animal would always be much, much larger than what would occur in nature. Or it would assume the form of an old man. And if you were careful enough to notice and paid attention, you would notice that the old man, he was bald, he was always dressed in green robes with a walking stick, but his beard would be made of grass growing from his face. That was a sure sign that you were dealing with something that wasn't human. If you were careful enough to notice these details, you would know what you were dealing with. Um, if you encounter it while it's in a male human form, it's because it wishes to talk at first. It wishes to communicate with you at first. Um, you may have information that it's curious about. It may be curious about you in general. It wants to know your story or your tale about you or your family. Um, and when it feels like it has enough information and you can provide no more entertainment to it, the Leshy would eat you. It would become a form, and the true form of a Leshy has been described um, as something goblin-like, with fangs, teeth, hairless body, gray body, short gray hairless body, with horns and a tail, um, with fiery red eyes, and all the horns and the teeth and the talons and the barb on its tail would always be white, and its body would be a form of gray. That was a natural form of the Leshy as it was described. But you would never encounter this in this natural form until it was ready to eat you. And by then it's too late. You've become a meal. Now, the same is true for the animals that it would become. It would these larger than normal, larger than the natural forms that they would assume of these animals. They would walk up, or if the hunter was out there and they would appear as these large prey items for the hunter. They would let the hunter get close enough, and the hunter would be shooting arrows at it right and left, or throwing spears at it right and left, never seeming to be able to strike the animal. And the animal would only pretend to turn and run for a very short distance before it would turn back and wait for the hunter to catch back up with it. Um, it was essentially playing with its food before it assumed its form to eat you. Now, the Leshy usually do not work together. Oh, you're gonna have to wait till you have to wait, Chris, for the end, because we're gonna leave Europe and we're gonna come to the Appalachian Mountains very soon. And you'll like I put that ambiguous statement in the description for the video tonight. It's I believe that some form of these forest spirits have found their way to the United States, but that is neither here nor there for now. We're going to get to that very soon. I think you'll enjoy that because there's a reason why I started to research and to look up information about these creatures and discovering these creatures, and you'll find out later in this tale about why I did that. And trust me, it's scary as shit. You You'll never want to walk in the woods alone, especially in the Smoky Mountains or the Appalachian Mountains. Well, there's a lot of reasons not to do that, but anyway, because there's a lot more critters out there, but I digress. Leshy usually operated alone, they lived alone, but there is another forest spirit that they would sometimes work with, that they would share their meals with, and it was called a chort, and that's Chort. Um, it's an obscure little goblin-like creature that looked very much like a leshy in its natural form, except for it was a lot skinnier, um, and it wore clothes in its natural form. They were also said to be, if anybody studies um, Russian mythology and legend, uh, the Chort was believed to be the race of Chort, were believed to be the children of the god Chernobog, who Chernobog was a god of and a spirit of darkness and violence who demanded blood sacrifices on every full moon. It was a violent sort. And these were his children that he put upon the earth to plague mankind, were the Chort. Now, when Leshy had a Chort to come into its forest or its territory, they would greet them, of course, fondly because they are similar creatures with similar tastes. But the Chort had a specific taste for children. And the Chort did not, they were shape changers, but they weren't very good at it. Chort were. The Leshy were the master shape changers. Like I said before, they could become anything. Um, so the Leshy would go forth and wait in the forest and go seeking out children who would wander from their home into the forest or were traveling through the forest with their parents. And it would lure them off of the trails into the forest where it would grab them and then it would share its catch with the Chort. So they would both enjoy a child snack. But that's what most of the tales that parents told their kids about wandering off into the forest is that they could become the food to these things and try to scare the shit out of them so they wouldn't wander away and disappear and never be heard from again. So, uh, but as we all well know, aside from the Native American populations that we have here in North America and South America and throughout the Caribbean, um, that our country in particular was a country of immigrants, that people came from all over the world, especially old world Europe, and they brought with them their stories, they brought with them their legends, they brought with them their deities, they brought with them the spirits, what they told the stories about. They brought them with them, and I do believe that once people started immigrating from the Baltic area um, of Europe and the dark forests of Germany, and they immigrated from um, places like Russia to the United States, that they brought these forest spirits with them. As I said earlier, the Leshy would lose power when it stepped outside of its forest. Um, as people began to leave the villages and move to more city like dwellings, and they moved off the farmlands and moved out of these rural communities into more secure and civilized communities. The Leshy lost a valuable source of nourishment and food and entertainment. But instead of fading away into obscurity or fading back into the ephemeral spirit world, they chose to leave their forests to follow their food. Again, when they would leave their forest, they would shrink down to the size of a blade of grass. They'd lose their ability to change shapes. They would just these little gray mouse-like things that left the forests, and they climbed into the backpacks, into the trunks of people, and they rode with them to the United States. Now, I have no definitive proof um, of that part of the story that is how they got here, but I suspect that's how they got here, considering that these things never died out. Uh, but they did figure out ways to leave their forest and discover new forests where food was plentiful and prey was plentiful and entertainment was more entertaining. And that brings us here to, here, one of the first colonies here and was in, of course, here in Virginia. Um, and a lot of the people, as the colonies expanded and people started working further inland, and other colonies were established along the coast of the United States from all of these various peoples throughout Europe that were coming to the New World to start over. They brought with them in their backpacks, in their books, and in their memories, and in their rituals and traditions, they brought these critters with them. Um, and wherever they settled at, these creatures went into the surrounding forests and established their territories there. And because they were not born of the earth that these people settled in, um, they lost a lot of what they were, a lot of the power that they had when they were in the forest in which they were born in, or created in, or stepped out into. And they had to adapt to it. Because, in nature, and in a natural sense, and also in an unnatural sense, there is natural selection and there is unnatural selection. An unnatural selection, I use that term. You should have a lot of shit to be worried about in the woods there, in Scotland. There's all kinds of interesting things I could tell you about the things that live in the ground there in Scotland, which you probably are well aware of too, Chris. That I would definitely walk out in Scotland with armed to the teeth with things in my pockets to ward off the critters that live there. But here in the United States, people move further out and further out from communities and establish their own communities, and that's what happened here in the Appalachia mountain chain. Is that the various groups of people settled throughout here, and the critters like the Leshy found its way into the Appalachian Mountains. Again, like I said, through natural or unnatural selection, either you adapt or you die, or you adapt and you fade away. These things are smart, smarter than your average human. So they found ways to adapt and to adapt their abilities within the community. And the families who settled in these different mountainous communities, and also in the Great Smoky Mountains. That's the tale that I'm leading to. Is if you ever go to the Smoky Mountains, you'll understand where I'm going at with this part, which of course is part of the Appalachian mountain chain. Um, but where was I? People thought they had left these things behind, but they figured out very quickly, when children began to disappear again in the woods, or people began to disappear in the woods, they realized that they had brought these creatures with them to their communities, that they couldn't escape them. So the tales, they were, again, the tales that they used to warn children with were began to be told again. In the name, because most of these communities, if you go and listen to the accents of a lot of the mountain communities there, um, the accents are not exactly European, and they're not exactly an American accent. It can be an odd blend of the two when you hear someone speak. And a lot of these communities, even in modern times, are still very insular, with very little breeding outside of the communities there, and very little new blood that comes into the community to pollute their ways. Trust me when I if the stories I can tell you about that. Well, the name Leshy, of course, is a Slavic word that somehow it went from being called a Leshy to being called a rook, and that's an R-U-K, not R-O-K, not R-O-O-K. That kind of a rook actually refers to a raven, but a ruck refers to these particular critters, the Leshy. And what I'm about to tell you is the story that my great grandmother and my grandmother always told me on a weekly basis. They would make me listen to the story to warn me, because as a child, I wandered, the mountainside. I wandered the creeks and the rivers and the waterfalls and the caves of the mountains up there. I was a child of the earth, uh, born and bred, flat out. Um, Very rarely did I wear shoes. My feet became, I always would joke, I told my kids here that my feet became hobbit feet. I could walk across hot coals and not feel them. I could climb up rocks and not feel them whatsoever, because as thick as the soles of my feet became. But they would always tell me the story of the rook, and I've never been able to figure out how the word leshy, if it is indeed what I think it is, somehow devolved, the name devolved into the word ruck. Um, but this is the story they would tell me. When you go into the woods, there are many things to be afraid of, but the most fearsome of things to find in the woods, or that will find you in the woods, would be the ruck. The ruck, if it would find your name when it looked at you, it would know everything it could know. It would know everything about you, especially your name. And it would be in the woods, and it would call your name. And it would usually call your name in the voice of somebody that you trusted in your family or a friend. You would hear your name being called in the woods. Um, and if you were foolish enough to wander off the trail into the woods, I mean, you would usually not wind up dead. You'd never be found again. No trace of you would be found ever again. But if you didn't wander off the trail, it would try another. The rook would always try another tactic, because the rook was sly. It was a sneaky beast. He would go up on the trail and appear before you, always facing you, never turning his back from you. Know that when it does not turn its back to you or turn to side you, that this is not nothing but a rook, because it is a rook. Oh God, I sounded like my grandmother when I said that. Um, it would appear as a small child. It appears somebody they trusted, but only from the front, when you were looking directly at it, would it appear as something else. It would appear as that person that you trusted. It would look exactly human when it faced you. But if you were able to angle yourself to the side or look at it from behind, you would see it as a monster. You would see it as a gray monster with patches of brown fur on its body and feathers on its tail. That's how it was described to me as. With shiny gold eyes. So the color yellow appears a lot in various folklore and myths, because the color yellow was never something positive. It would always denote something negative. So it appears a lot in superstition and folklore. and lore in general, just as an FYI aside there. And it would always want you to come closer. It would never come closer to you, but it would always beckon for you to come closer to make the first move. And when you got close enough, it would drop its mask and show you as the fanged monster that it was, because it had a head. It had the head of a deer, but the muzzle of a wolf and the teeth of a wolf, and it would devour you on sight or take you off to its cave and devour you at its leisure. Always saving your heart for last, because that was its favorite treat, would be your heart. Now, as you can probably imagine, there were always members of the community. Now, this isn't applied to the kids, because there were a number of hunters during the winter that would go in the woods and literally hunt for food during the winter, or get firewood out in the deep parts of the woods and the drier parts of the mountains. The hunt for wood. That sometimes these people disappeared, and it was always, said that they probably fell victim to a ruck. Um, they would never approach a group of people. It would always approach single people. Again, it enjoyed the taste of children the most. So it would always go for a child first. But the story was for hunters in the wintertime, um, when a hunter disappeared, or they would find his gun, or they'd find his bow and quiver in the woods. Sometimes after the thaw, they'd find those things in the woods, but they'd never find the body. But they say the ruck would particularly go after them, hunters in the winter, because they were hunting something that they shouldn't be hunting in the woods during that time of year, that the ruck thought were off limits. Like if one winter that the ruck said it was protecting deer, if anybody was hunting deer in its land, it would kill the person that was hunting that deer in the land, and as a warning. But of course, it would devour the body, where it would never be seen from again. Um, or if you were hunting squirrels or raccoons, it would go after you definitely. Never found bones. Never found bones. Um, but there would always be some sort of grave marker that would be added to the family cemetery. You can go to the Appalachian now and go to these communities, even if you can convince them to talk to you still. If they will talk to you still, um, or if you visit their cemeteries on the mountainside and in some of the more secluded valleys, you'll see that you'll see that a lot of stones and markers and crosses and to mark where the dead were supposed to be buried at are actually very close together. That's because there's no body in those graves. It was something that was not able to recover. They were not able to recover a body to put within these graves. And you would see other parts of the cemetery where there was wide spaces between the markers, because that's where actual bodies were buried at. And I've always found it quite fascinating, even growing up and the few times that I've gone back home, um, that you'll see newer markers and newer gravestones that are still so close together like that are within a foot apart of each other. And there's no body in that grave because something happened to them out there, to where there was no body to be recovered, no remains to be recovered whatsoever. That they usually fell victim to one of the mountain predators that exist out there. Because trust me, the ruck was the least of the things that could get you in the mountains. But it was one of the scarier things when you're a child that'll get you in the mountains. I'll pause for a second. Any questions from anybody before I go into what I believe was a close shave I think I had with something like the ruck at the time? Any questions, comments, concerns? Okay. Those were the stories that were told of the ruck, and everybody knew the stories of the ruck. There were many there were many cautionary tales about many of the things that lived out there on the mountainside. Um, But again, as a small child, having something that would lure you out and eat you like that, that's definitely terrifying. Okay. It was I was about, gosh, 9 or 10 years old, and I was famous for wandering away from my grandmother's great-grandmother's and my mother's house. Um, which, by the way, with mountain people, just to let everybody know, when you hear me talk about the mother's or the grandmother's house or great-grandmother's house, the women were the keepers of the house and of the homestead. The men provided it and upkept it. It was just the way things were and the way things are and the way things will always be. Um, so you'll hear me say their house, but they were married. It was one of the many occasions I decided to wander off. It was in the spring, but it was early spring, so there was still a little snow on the ground, still a little snow in the trees. The hawthorn and the hawthorn trees, especially, and the witch hazel trees were just beginning to blossom because they always are the first trees in the mountains to blossom. The mountain laurel was beginning to bloom as well. Those were the big things that would always tell you that spring was right around the corner when these three things were happening. And I was out there as a child looking for sassafras, small young sassafras trees growing on the mountainside. Because one of the favorite treats, if you were a mountain kid, was chewing on sassafras root. It tastes if you've never chewed on a piece, if you've never chewed sassafras root, you're missing out in your life. Sassafras root. It's a lot of medicinal benefits, but it was sweet, and you never got much candy except for during the holidays or special occasions, or many sweets at all when you were a mountain kid growing up. So you would eat the sweet things you would find in the woods, and sassafras was one of our favorite ones, and it always tasted best in the fall and early spring when the roots had the most sap in them before the sap began to go up the tree for it to leaf out. So you'd always pull up these little saplings and clean off the roots in a creek and chew on them, and they were freaking delicious. Oh my gosh! Um, and if you had enough left over, you took it home and you got your mom or grandma or great grandma to make you sassafras tea out of it, which is that was soda to us. That was soda to us. That was the Pepsi or Coca Cola with sassafras tea. That stuff was so good. And again, very naturally, it had a natural sweetness to it too. Um, but just a quick side, if you got some sassafras that wasn't completely sweet, that was still a little bitter, we would use the pods from honey locust that we would crush and add to the tea, which would sweeten it really well too. It was quite tasty. That honey locust was also a favorite thing for the mountain kids to eat and drink. So, oh my god, dude, what on sassafras? You should. Sassafras is a mountain. There are many mountain treats. The sassafras, the pawpaw tree, pawpaws. If you've never had a pawpaw, and it's Pawpaw. Fresh pawpaws when they turn yellow actually taste like a combination of um, banana and guava. It's just an awesome taste. Fresh wild pawpaw. It's an amazing taste. Every other part of the plant was poisonous except for the fruit. And chinkapin nuts were delicious to roast and crack open and eat. God, you guys had me musing on the childhood treats I got in the woods. I could go on forever for that with that. Chicken pens were amazing, but you'd have to fight the local wildlife and a lot of bears too. So okay, I was wandering off to dig some sassafras because I wanted sassafras. I wanted something sweet, and I didn't want to bring any of my cousins along with me either because they were fucking greedy. They'd usually eat more in their share, but I'd be the one doing all the work to pull the damn thing up out of the ground. So I walked out past the pig and goat lot, and I wandered deep into the woods past that, past our border stones. And border stones in mountain communities would denote where one family's property began and ended at, around the property, the border stones. And our border stones were an ironite type, iron rich rock that was a local rock that came out of the ground that was nearly round when it would come out of the ground. It's a strange rock if you ever see it, but it contains high amounts of iron ore in it. Um, and again, they come out of the ground in these almost perfect round shape, and they were used to mark the borders of different of families' land, so you know where you were going. And we were famous for those rocks. We had a very, which I'm not going to repeat the name because it would get me in so much trouble. We had a very profane name for those rocks, um, which at some point in my life I'll share, but it's such an impolitic name that I would get roasted over the coals if I said it, because the term is still being used by the mountain folk to describe these rocks, and it's so filthy and it's so wrong and so impolitic. Um, okay. Of course, I wandered out looking for sassafras, going down the trails, and I noticed right away, but didn't really think about it very much as I was heading deeper into the mountains and further up the mountainside, that the trails that we're on were not covered in. No, I can't repeat that name on YouTube. Oh my God, if I repeated that name on YouTube, this channel would get blown the fuck up. You don't understand. It's a very, I'll just say this. It was an ethnic slur. I'll let you use your imagination. It was an ethnic slur that was used. Um, but we didn't think anything of it. We just thought of it. It was to us, it was an adjective. It wasn't an ethnic slur. You have to think of the communities that I grew up in. I have long since gotten that breeding out of me, and became a lot more civilized once I left the mountains. Oh God, I'll do it, dude, but there's absolutely no way you can record it. You don't, when I tell you the name of it. And there's a story about why it's called that too. And that story is really bad because it's a true story. That It's really bad. It's really bad. Okay, the first thing I noticed when I left, past the border stones, the marker stones on our family property, is that being the time of year, there should still be leaves on the trail. And I just thought casually to myself, wow, the trail is really clear. There were no leaves on it. It was wide open and inviting. Um, and there were a lot of birds singing at the time. And if you've ever been in the mountains, again, the beginning of spring, like that, early parts of spring, you don't hear a lot of birds. The birds usually stay off the sides of the mountains until it gets a lot warmer and there's a lot more food available to them, and they'll move further up into the mountains and you get to hear and see them more. Um, I didn't even hear any squirrels or chipmunks when I was up there either. There was just no sounds. I thought, wow, this is pretty freaking cool. It's really quiet up here. I like this. As I was going along this bare and barren trail, and I heard, past a patch of mountain laurel. Mountain laurel is an evergreen that is mainly found in the Appalachian Mountains. It's an evergreen. It has a lot of medicinal uses to it. It's quite huge. It gets really big bushes and absolutely beautiful plants and beautiful flowers on it. But every single part of this plant is medicinal, for lowering fevers, bloodborne ailments and stomach ailments. I mean, these mountain laurels, absolutely amazing. Plus, the flowers would be used to as a sort of potpourri perfume in houses too, because they gave off the most intoxicating scent when they blew. And there was a huge patch of mountain laurel, and around the mountain laurel, again off to the side, around it grew a plant called running cedar. It's a ground parasitic type plant that grows there. It's quite beautiful. It's an evergreen as well. And I heard something say, "Hey, Peter." For those of you who don't know, um, I have, you gotta love my family for that. I have four names that my family gave me. My first name, which is my father's name, one of my middle names, which is one of my grandfather's first names. My second middle name is the grandfather from the other half of my family's first name, and the last name is my family's surname. So, oh, dude, I'd love to talk about herbology. That's one of my specialties is mountain medicine and herbology. Um, Hell's bells. I might even break out some of my apothecary jars and share those too if we ever did that if we ever did a show on that, Chris. That'd be kind of fun. Um, Probably educate a lot of people out there too. Uh, and I heard something say, I would be happy to do one with y'all as well, Papa Joey. um, because a lot of local folk cures and mountain cures um, found their way a lot of times and they found their way into modern medicine. And people don't realize that a lot of the painkillers we have and a lot of the treatments that we have, we owe to people, the mountain people, and for the mountain medicine. And again, I inherited all that knowledge, the bulk of that knowledge from my family. So, okay, I gotta stop being distracted because we could talk about this shit all night long. But we're talking about my close encounter with a rock. Off to the side is I heard something say, "Hey, Pete. Hey, Peter." I jumped out of my skin when I heard that, and I whirled around because it was really fast, just like a, "Hey, hey, Peter, hey." And I spun around and I looked over into the mountain laurel, and there was something standing in the middle of that patch of mountain laurel. Um, I say something because it moved with the grace. Something it moved with the grace of something otherworldly. I could make out parts of it in the shadowy because you have to remember Mount Laurel's a huge plant. Um, and it was standing in the middle of it, which I thought was peculiar in the first place. We never played hide and seek in it. The plant was too sacred to us to ever do that to that. So I thought it was weird that it was standing in the middle of this patch of laurel. And I looked over there at it, and I caught flashes of a face that looked like mine. Pieces of the face. It was, if you've ever poured oil on water, I'm talking about motor oil on water, and watched how it flowed across the water. This is how the features of its face look like. Um, as it flowed out between the ripples, I would see bits and pieces of my face. I'd see my nose, I'd see my eyes, I'd see my forehead, I'd see my mouth. Um, and it kept saying my name, "Hey Pete, hey Pete." And one of the things that my grandmother always told me, my great grandmother too, is that if you do come across a rock in the woods or something you suspect is a rock, is that you never ask it a question. You don't ask it, "Who are you? What are you doing here? What do you want?" Because you're inviting it to come closer to you. And I believe that's what it wanted me to do. It wanted to walk out of that patch of mountain laurel and come closer to me. It wanted me to acknowledge it but my legs had gone numb. I couldn't feel my legs. I couldn't feel my hands or my arms, my extremities. It was sheer terror that I was experiencing at the time. Because this thing with an oil slick of a face that was fading in and out to look like me was calling my name. And then it asked, "Do you want to see something? Do you want to see something? I've got something. Do you want to see something?" And I saw a hand reach out from the laurel. And the hand looked like my hand. It looked like a normal child's hand. But at the wrist, it was coal black. The arm was absolutely coal black. Oh, I was like 9 or 10, maybe 11 years old. Yes, they let us wander in the woods at that age, Papa Joey. Um, they didn't give a fuck. They thought we could. They gave us all the tools in which to take care of ourselves with, and if we were foolish enough to, and the rules to take care of ourselves with, and we were foolish enough to break those rules and not use those tools wisely, we understood that we would usually die, and it'd be your own damn fault for doing it. It was a tough life, I'll tell you. It was a tough life. And like I said, behind the wrist, it was a coal black arm. And it was a much longer arm because it was stretching it through the mountain laurel to beckon me to come a little bit closer to it, for me to move closer to it. And then I began to feel my feet because of the adrenaline and the fight or flight response was, I believe, was beginning to kick in when that happened. And I took a step backwards, and when I stepped backwards, I could see it out of my peripheral vision again because I stepped back and I kept looking up. I could see I was off to the side of it just a little bit, and I could see a tail or something that looked like a tail that was thrashing behind it like a cat, like a big cat that was about to pounce on its prey. That's what it reminded me of a great tomcat with its tail twitching because it was about to pounce. And that's when I said my first curse word. Something told me to get the fuck away from there. And I looked down at my feet immediately and I went, fuck this. And I turned around and I ran as fast as I could back down the side of that trail and back home as quickly as I could. And as I was running, I kept hearing something behind me that sounded like, it would sound like 2 legs running, and then it would sound like 4 legs running. And I swear to everything that I believe in, that it sounded like 6 legs running, 6 feet coming down at the same time, running behind me. But once I got back to our home and and crossed over and crossed the marker stones of our family, it stopped. I turned around. That's the only time I turned around. I couldn't fucking breathe. I don't know how I breathed running like that. But I realized I had not taken much of a breath flying off the side of that hillside until I got past those stones. And I looked back behind me, and I just heard the leaves. Sounded like something back there was pounding and clawing at the leaves. And then it stopped, like it never was. And I do believe that the rook was a leshy that had. And it was many, many years later, as I told my grandmother and great-grandmother about it. I got my ass torn up that night, too. Well, not too bad, because they were so worried about me when I told that story that they would go to every member of the family. Do you hear what just happened to him? After everything we've told him, look what he went and did. Scared the fuck out of my cousins, too, when they heard that story. They wouldn't leave their houses. They wouldn't leave their house for fucking months afterwards because they were scared to go out there in the woods after hearing about what happened to me out there. But it wasn't until decades later when I began to research the paranormal and supernatural that I realized that the story of the Leshy sounded very much like my encounter that day in the woods. And that's when I was able to, and later on, I was able to put together It was scary. It was scary. A lot of the stuff that happened was scary enough for me to remember it. And you can probably still find members of my extended family in the mountains that'll probably tell you that story again. Remember that time your ass almost got it? um, they still like telling that. They still will tell that story about me almost getting eaten in the woods by a ruck. But I believe the ruck is an adapted leshy, a leshy that adapted itself in the woods and adapted itself to its predatory lifestyle here in the Appalachian Mountains. Thank you. That it adapted itself, you know, to be able to survive. And I was lucky enough to get away from it. But over the decades, I've had close encounters with sometimes by accident, sometimes by me being foolish. I've had a lot of encounters with the supernatural and paranormal world and the paranormal world on the cryptid side and the supernatural world. Usually, sometimes by design, other times for being foolish, from wanting to go out and experience it firsthand to see if it was real or not, what people were talking about was real or not. And it's gotten me in trouble. And I'll be honest with you, it's almost gotten me killed on several occasions too, being foolish like that. Actually, that story is in the book, by the way, my book. And I was saving this for Saturday, but Papa Joey hasn't heard this. Papa Joey, I have a book that I'm in the middle of litigation about right now for using cousins' names and family members' names without their permission. And some members of my family are a bunch of litigious assholes, but it's holding up the release of it for about another month. We're almost through this bullshit because I'm coming out the other side winning it. But that is neither here nor there. Let's see. Well, is that magic time? um, it is that magic time. I hope everybody enjoyed the tale tonight. Um, enjoyed my theories. Enjoyed the history lesson. Enjoyed the family history lesson. And I look forward to having you all on my next live. I'm soothing. Oh shit, you really, dude, you really, really need to share that with members of my family. I am the least bit soothing. In my work life, because of course we have our own we have multiple home businesses, so and it ain't soothing. But everybody have a great night. Please, if you like what you heard tonight, hit the like button. If you wish to get notifications, hit the subscribe and the notification button on the channel. You can find Mike the Naked Bigfoot on Twitter. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter. You can DM me, no dick pics. You can DM me. Feel free to join me on Twitter. I do discuss the paranormal on occasion, give you updates of what's going on um, in the wild and crazy paranormal life of mine. Um, but until next time, it has been fun, guys. I always enjoy sharing stories of the wild stories of the mountains with everyone. Have a great night, and look forward to having you back again for some more stories, some more story time. See ya.